I had such like a vision. I'm like, Matthew, I need to be able to like lay out. I did the lettering in this book as well. And like I need to have like this weird lettering going on because it needs to look like the world's uh ugliest pamphlet that like a church would hand out to you. And I I really that's the vibe I wanted.
Okay, everyone, I'd like to welcome to Comix Asylum Podcast, Sam Beck, extraordinaire writer and illustrator working on her creator-owned, project called Verse.
Hi, nice to be here.
So, Sam, how's everything been? How's 2024 been treating you so far?
It's been going really well, working on some unannounced books right now, two of them to be exact. So really hectic and busy, but work is good.
Perfect. So, to kick off the show, tell us about Verse.
Yeah, so I can give you kind of like the elevator or picture it. So Verse is it's a YA graphic novel series, a trilogy. It's a fantasy series. And Verse is set in a world where magic is feared, and only these monsters known as the Vel know how to use it. That, of course, is what Fife, one of the main characters, thinks and believes until he meets this young girl named Nithya, who kind of looks like the Vel and also knows how to use magic, and it kind of like throws this whole belief down the drain. And they kind of go on this journey together to learn about who Nithya is, why she can do what she does. And yeah, they embark on this like big kind of adventure to learn more about the world.
Excellent. And writing a YA series, has that changed your approach to storytelling?
Yeah, so what's interesting with Verse specifically is I started it out as a webcomic in 2019, actually. And it ran as a webcomic for about a year and a half before the first book was done. And then it eventually got picked up by Vault, the current publisher. So like Verse was really the first comic I worked on as a solo writer. And it was like inspired by a lot of like manga and just like these big ensemble casts, which I really love in those kind of stories. So I don't think like writing for YA was like really ever in my mind. I just wanted to write a story that I would have enjoyed reading as like a 15-year-old.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Totally makes sense. And so what inspirations from, the manga or any of the fantasy genre, I'm assuming you're a fan of the genre,
Yeah.
did that inspire you to create Verse?
Yeah, so I mean like I've always liked fantasy kind of like novels growing up. I think like my journey is a bit strange in that like I was never really into comics like growing up. I read a lot of fantasy novels like Sabriel by Garth Nix was a really big inspiration for Verse. Then I kind of got into like manga and stuff later on in like high school. And it wasn't necessarily fantasy. I think some of my like big inspirations just for like getting into comics in general was the Trigun series, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
Love that. Like I own all of the all the volumes still. And it just made me really want to uh, draw comics. I think like fantasy in general, though, like I've always been drawn to as a creator because it's kind of this like big open space that you can really do a lot in. It's not very, it's like limitless in the types of stories you can tell.
Yeah, it is kind of like it's almost like a blank slate because
Yeah.
the rules are whatever the rules you want them to be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think like there's a lot of tropes in fantasy also. And I think that's actually really fun to kind of take some of those very well defined tropes and then play with them and make them a bit different, which is what I hope I do in Verse.
And so you started out as a graphic designer. And how did you transition from that career into comics?
Yeah, so out of high school, like I didn't have super great grades. I wasn't very good at math, and it kind of limited my like ability to apply to different universities here in Canada. So I'm like, okay, I'll do graphic design because I think I can make some money doing that. My parents won't like disown me. Um, so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do graphic design, and I really enjoyed it. Like I loved learning about that in school, and just learning print design and all of that kind of stuff. I actually really enjoyed it. And when I graduated, I kind of did a bit of print design for a year before transitioning into doing like mobile and app and web development, which was much more like soul sucking and less romantic than what I had envisioned in my university days. I did that for like 5, 6 years, and then one day I'm just like, I don't want to do this anymore. I feel like I'm contributing nothing to the world, just making these like apps for banks and stuff. I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I kind of saved up enough money to survive for a year. And I'm like, let me try just doing art and not even comics specifically. I was like, let me try being like a freelance illustrator. And if I can like swing it for a year and make enough like money to support myself, I'll stick with it. And like, thankfully, the stars aligned and I'm still doing it like 10 years later.
That's excellent, and it's quite the journey because like when you start out, like I'm a former teacher, so sometimes when you look at students and the paths that they want to choose, you never really end up where you started sometimes, especially
Mhm.
if technology changes, opportunities change, or you just realize, as you did, I'm in a job that I absolutely despise.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like my journey might have been different if like I was in a job I liked, because like I said, like I really do like graphic design. I think it's really helped kind of influence me as an artist, and like designing books and stuff. Like those two fields overlap a ton, especially when you're doing self-publishing stuff. But I think just like what I was doing in graphic design, working on like websites and stuff like that, was just not where I wanted to be. And I had to just take that risk of seeing if I could do art full time.
So then what was that moment then where you said, I'm done with the apps, I'm done with logos, I'm gonna make my own story?
I I think it was like one of those times where I don't know if you've ever been in a job where like you can go in and like nothing's happening. So like I would pull up like a notepad and just start writing away. It was really the first kind of story I was working on, and it didn't really come into being for a long time, but it's what I would poke away at while I was just like bored of work and not wanting to deal with clients and stuff. Just kind of write it down, sketch out things. Yeah, that's what I was doing.
And what then led you to webcomics?
So I think webcomics. Let me sing the praise for webcomics. They're fantastic because there's no gatekeeping. If you know, not even like if you want to draw and you want to tell stories, you can make a webcomic. There's like no entry fee. You don't need to know anything, right? And I felt like, okay, I'm not gonna go out and like I had no idea that there was agents. Like I had no idea about the publishing industry. All I knew is that I wanted to make a story. So I'm like, I'm gonna make a web comic. I've been reading them beforehand. I'm like, this seems like the best way to like get something out there and just learn about making comics, because I had never made one before Verse or before doing this web comic. So I think webcomics are fantastic for people that are starting out in comics. And I think they're fantastic for readers who want something different, because there's no, like I said, there's no gatekeeping. No one is telling you that you need to like make a story for a middle grade audience. You can just do whatever you want.
That's true. And then so going from webcomics to Vault, how did that happen?
Yes, so like I mentioned before, I had kind of finished the first, so versus 3 books. I had finished the first book as a webcomic. It was all online, and I decided to kickstart it to get it into print. Because for me, what webcomics was less about the medium and having it be online. Like, let me rearrange my thoughts. When I was drawing verse, I drew it with the intention of it going to print because that's the background I came from. So I wanted to kickstart it myself, and that's what I did for the first book. went around to a bunch of conventions in 2019. And at one of them, I met my editor, Rebecca Taylor, who ended up really liking verse, and basically was like, hey, Vault, do you want to like pick this up for a whole series? Like, Sam, do you want to do this? I'm like, yes, I do. I love getting paid to do what I love. So like first, the first book was just all my own, and then kind of half of book two and book three, I worked with Rebecca, my editor, to kind of fit it more into like a middle grade YA audience. It was more focused, and I'm really grateful for that because doing a web comic, it was like riding a train and building the rails as the train is moving. That's how I approached it, at least. So being able to work with an editor and like being exposed to a publisher where I had to like present an idea and collaborate with someone was a really good experience. And it changed how book three kind of came into being. Like it was much more direct, and I think if I could go back, I would have loved to have worked with someone who could have focused me a bit more. um, but I'm still happy with what I did. It was such like a great learning experience.
No, it sounds like it. And you'd mentioned being, I guess, the train conductor and building the tracks at the same time. You
Yeah.
do everything on verse, right?
Yeah.
What is the most challenging or rewarding aspect of doing all of those at the same time?
So I think like I'm an illustrator first and a writer second. So the most challenging thing for me is writing and kind of getting all my ideas into a coherent story, especially when you're talking about a trilogy where you need to like connect whatever happened 600 pages ago and make sure it makes sense 600 pages later or whatever. So that was really challenging for me. And I think I learned like a lot writing it. Like I said, if I could go back, there's things I would change, but I don't find it very, like, I don't find it a good use of time to kind of go back and like continually edit your past work. Like it just has to exist as it is. Uh, and the next thing I make will have all that knowledge and hopefully, you know, be improved upon, at least in my eyes.
And so when you're drawing, and so you've already written it and then you're drawing, do you then, since you're lettering it and coloring it as well too, are you thinking of all of the different steps at the same time, or are you like compartmentalizing, going, I'm writing and now I'm drawing and now I'm going to letter and now I'm going to color, or however your
I
process
think
works?
I think I do a bit more compartmentalizing than other people who do everything works. So like I will just sit down and write it, and like I have like a good idea of what it's going to look like in my head, but by the time I get to doing like thumbnails and layouts, that's when really you can see how the flow of the story is going to work. And at that point, I have the luxury of just being like, this needs like an extra 5 pages or something, or I need to like really edit this conversation. So I do a lot of like editing of the scripts and paneling while I'm doing the layouts, which is something that you don't typically do if you're working with a writer or another collaborator. So there's a bit more like flexibility there, which I really enjoy.
And how much input does your editor have? Like, and at what stage does the editor kind of come in? Are they there along the way, or do they say, come to me at this stage and then we'll go over your notes and I'll then give some feedback to you? How does it work for you?
Yeah, so what was interesting was verse, like each book is kind of set up into 4 chapters. So I was able to kind of write one chapter and then go with it to my editor, and we'd kind of look at it and see what's working and what's not working. I gave her a lot of very rough notes, and I do my planning in like Excel spreadsheets sometimes. I would show her that. So it was very all over the place, but she got it. We were we had a really good relationship. I really enjoyed working with her. So even though my notes were kind of erratic and I didn't present her like a very polished script, we were able to like go back and edit things. But usually it was mostly in that writing part where a lot of the editing was happening. Once I got into the art, I think there was a lot of trust that I could achieve what I wanted to do. So by the time I got to the art, there was very little editing at all. So that was nice.
Oh, that's good. That's
Yeah.
in a way it's kind of liberating because then it gives you the kind of freedom to kind of move forward with whatever you're doing and not always kind of like looking over your shoulder or second guessing yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. And so aside from verse, you also have an upcoming graphic novel called Loving Ohio with Matthew
Yes.
Erman, and that's out of
Yeah.
Dark Horse. What can you tell us
Yeah.
about that project?
Yeah. So Loving Ohio, a fantastic story. I really enjoyed working with Matthew on that one. I've worked I've collaborated with other writers before, so it wasn't like a totally new thing for me. But Matthew was amazing to work with because he gave me the kind of flexibility and the leniency for me to like push back on a lot of things. Um, because he provided, a fantastic script, but was really open to me being like, hey, I think we should change this around. It might flow a bit better this way. So that's a great person to have as a collaborator. Loving Ohio itself, though, is a graphic novel. It's about teens in Ohio. They're kind of in the aftershock of one of their friends committing suicide. And they're dealing with that grief, but also this like mysterious death cult and the fact that other teens are just mysteriously disappearing and being murdered. And it's kind of them figuring out what's going on uh, in their town and how to deal with both, you know, grief that happened in the past and like this continued kind of force of awfulness that's happening. I always feel bad trying to describe living in Ohio. Matthew does a really good job of it. I'm just like, I did the art. I'm not as good as the elevator pitch as he is. But I really enjoy drawing it. It's very stylistically, it's very different from my usual like fantasy stuff. It looks very different, I think, from what verse is. And that's because the story was something very new and different to me. And I really enjoyed drawing it.
Well, I was going to ask because the YA drawings that you've done and that kind of genre and that space, because of the subject matter, the art will have a different kind of a look, right?
Mhm.
What you're describing in Loving Ohio seems to be a bit heavier.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
so how did you approach, I guess, character design, how you were going to lay out your pages, even just the tone to change from what you're doing with verse to what you're doing with Loving Ohio?
So I think when you see the art for both of these comics, like how I draw characters and people looks the same. You can clearly go like, oh, that's like Sam. That's how Sam Beck would draw a teenager. But I think for Living Ohio, a big part of like making it feel different stylistically was for one thing, it's like a super limited color palette, which is I was like really set on only working with like a narrow range of colors, and it really kind of pushed how abstract and how stylized some of these pages look in it. So I'm really happy with that. It was influenced by like risograph, which is where you have two or three colors. The fidelity is quite low when you're sending it through to the printer, and I wanted that kind of like grungy look, even though the book is being printed, beautiful offset printer. I wanted it to feel grungy and have that like, I don't know, rough look. So the type of like, I work digitally, but the type of like brushes I used were a lot thicker. There's a lot more like variation. It looks rough in a very intentional way, I think, and I think that really helps like carry the story with this like, I don't know, this like grungy, dark, moody vibe to it.
No, that makes total sense. And I guess you would then reach back into your graphic design toolbox to kind of inform how you could approach the I guess the style that you wanted for this one?
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, a really fun thing with Loving Ohio is I designed the book cover as well, and like the title for it. And there's some like design stuff, some matter in the book that uses this like very weirdly typeset text. And I had such like a vision. I'm like, Matthew, I need to be able to like lay out. I did the lettering in this book as well. And like, I need to have like this weird lettering going on because it needs to look like the world's uh, ugliest pamphlet that like a church would hand out to you. And I really, that's the vibe I wanted for like the title and like some of the stuff when you open up the page. Like it looks bad in an intentional way because in Loving Ohio, there's this cult that's called the Chorus, and they're mysterious and weird. And I'm like, this is the kind of material they would hand out to you, weirdly typeset, kind of off-putting, and I wanted to carry that into the book as well.
Kind of
That was
ironic.
really fun for me.
I'm sure, and it's kind of ironic that the worst looking pamphlet in the world that you're trying to design is actually what's drawing all these people to their doom.
Yes.
So does going back and forth between styles and genres, so going back between verse and any other projects that you're doing, does it take a while for you to kind of change gears or get back into those worlds?
So I mean, thankfully, when I'm working on a book, I'm usually just working on one book at a time. So I don't have to be like switching gears constantly. I think for me, it's not difficult. It's actually really refreshing to be able to work on something so different. So yeah, I look forward to being able to work on projects that are just totally different from my usual like fantasy stuff, which is what verse is. So yeah, I look forward to that. I think it's good to push yourself to do something a bit different.
Oh no, for sure, for sure. And outside of the comic book and the manga kind of realm, are there any things that you use as influences, whether it's music, I guess looking still at graphic design? Do you draw from anything else in pop culture?
Yes, I think this goes for verse specifically. I'm a huge like video game person, love video games, love like JRPGs especially. And when I was writing verse initially, one of like the things that stuck in my mind was like when you pick up like a classic JRPG, like a Final Fantasy or something, there's a concept of like magic in the video game where like people can like use fireballs or like really wild stuff. I'm like, where's the consequence to this? Like, why aren't they using this amazing magic to like power their furnaces or something? Anyway, so when I went back into verse, I'm like, what if magic was actually like a very useful tool, and what would happen if that tool disappeared, which is what happens in verse. So that was a big thing for me. There's like series like Dragon Age and even just like other RPGs in general, where like you gather your party and
Right.
you travel with them. They all have their own kind of motives and arcs and stories. And I've always been really like drawn to this. Like I've taken this disparate group of people and brought them together to somewhat of a common cause. And we're gonna sit around the campfire and become friends with each other. And we're gonna talk to each of them and learn what they want and what they don't want. I just really like that.
Yeah, the motley crew on a quest, right?
Yeah, it's great. Like
And then
that's
they,
like
yeah.
such a trope, and it's so fantastic to like dig into that. It's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, it's mine too. I remember, oh, this is kind of dating me, but I remember when the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon came out and I was a kid, and that kind of hooked me. And then that got me into playing a little bit of D&D in high school. And you got to be able to like create your own characters, whether it was a thief or a mage or whatever. And it totally allows you to kind of get outside of your own kind of personality, but then also learn to deal with people in this game world that kind of reflects how life is, right? When you're working on a
Yeah.
book, you're kind of a motley crew. You got your writer, your editor, your artist, and you're all going towards a common goal, but everyone has their own kind of experience that they bring to the table.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. And like it's fun when there's friction and people don't agree on what they want to do. That's that's the beautiful part of those stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because then you get to see the characters as they truly are, right? Like, what are
Yeah,
they? What are they going to stand on?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm all for smoke in group settings.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so, what can people expect from you upcoming? Will Verse have I guess, a second trilogy, or does it kind of end there?
No, it's what like because I've been working on verse for such a long time. I'm so grateful that I got to actually do 3 books as like a first time creator. That's I think like a wild thing to even think of. Like no one expects to be able to write 3 like 200-page books as their first project.
Right.
But it's done now. I've closed the book on it. I'm like, you were so near and dear to my heart, but like I've grown so much in the past, like 5 years that like I never want to touch that again.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. Sometimes the characters you create do overstay their welcome because you want to do other stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love the characters, but I just think like my not my taste, but like just how I approach stories is so different now that it would be a disservice to like my growth to like continue to play around in that thing that's now so old and so different from where I am now.
Right. And do you have anything else on the horizon? Do you have another IP that you're kind of cooking up? What can we look forward from you?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm working on 2 books right now. Neither have been announced, so I can't really say more than like one is a fantasy book,
Uh-huh.
so very much the style of verse. Like I was kind of brought onto the project because of verse. So that's been really fun because it's like I have all the knowledge and the shorthand for fantasy. So that's been a very fun thing to work on. Looking forward to when that's announced. And then I'm also working on a sequel to, I'll say it. I don't think it's anything
No,
big.
no,
I
wait,
worked
wait,
on
wait,
a
hold on, hold on,
what?
hold on. If you're gonna go against what you should do, don't do it. But if you want to, go ahead.
It's a sci-fi. You can look at my portfolio and probably figure it out. It's like a sci-fi kind of like fun romp. It's a very humorous comic, but the sequel to that. So I'm working on that as well
That's cool.
with some writers. Yeah.
That's cool. So without getting into specifics, because we don't want to, we're spoiler free zone here. When you're doing the sci-fi stuff, how does your lens change as an illustrator from when you're doing fantasy?
Oh, so when I did the first book in that series, it was so difficult because I had to draw things like guns and cars and buildings. I'm like, I don't know how to do this. So it's less about like I think visually it looks similar to first. It's a very like clean style. It's very colorful. Um, but it's just like the subject matter was so outside of my comfort zone. But the writers I was working with, they knew my background and where I was coming from. So they're like, don't worry, Sam, we're going to put in like a scene in the background is ruins and mountains. I'm like, thank you. I do enjoy drawing that.
Yeah, yeah. So you would get to some pages where you get to kind of like have some fun as opposed to grit your teeth and
Yeah.
go, another car.
Yeah. Another car.
That's great. That's great. And moving forward, more collaborations with authors, or are you looking to do something like Verse where you're running the entire ship?
Yeah, so I think after the 2 books I'm working on, I really want to get back into to writing my own stories because verse is kind of the first thing, but it's been the only kind of long form story I've done. I've done short zines and things like that, but I haven't really worked on a long book outside of verse. I would love to kind of go back into writing, take what I've learned and do something new. I'm hoping to work on a cyberpunk type story. I know I feel like I've talked to you, I'm like everywhere. I love all genres. I want to explore everything. I don't want to like pigeonhole myself into something. So I'm looking to like work on a cyberpunk type story um, that will be stylistically also different from verse. It'd be cool to do it in black and white. I think that's underrepresented in North American markets.
Oh, definitely, definitely so.
We should have more uh, kind of free range to like do interesting things, black and white, 3-color prints, stuff like that.
Well, it hasn't hurt manga. The sales are quite good.
Exactly. You would
right?
think
Yeah,
that they
you would
would
think.
look at that.
I think everyone gets. I think we tend to get stuck in our silos, right? Like this is how we
Yeah.
do it here, as opposed to just embrace everything, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And go with it. And would there ever be a return to web comics?
Yeah, so I mean, kind of touched on this, like North American comics have a very set look and feel. And I think when you want to push that, whether it's the subject matter or how it looks, um, it's hard to sell it to publishers. So there's also the potential that you're just like, no, I have a vision and I want to do it. So back onto the web it goes.
Back onto the web and then Kickstarter again.
Yeah, exactly.
And to wrap up, what were your experiences with Kickstarter and crowdfunding?
I mean, it was great. I enjoyed it. It funded, obviously, so it was stressful. It was a very like narrow scope. Like I just wanted to print the book. I really had like no additional rewards or anything like that. I misjudged shipping costs, so that is my advice to everyone: is be aware of shipping because the time that the Kickstarter ran from when I costed it to like when it was done, the shipping cost changed completely and I had no buffer. So that Kickstarter made no money. It was like a zero net for me, but that's fine.
But the book's done and it's out and
Yeah.
fans were rewarded. But here's the thing
Yeah.
though, like there's so many kind of unknown elements that you run into when you do crowdfunding, right?
Yeah.
So how difficult fulfillment is, shipping is huge. Sometimes printing can catch people off guard depending on
Yeah.
whatever the print run is or quality of paper. There's so many little things that you encounter that you almost have to go through it the first time or go through it with someone who's really experienced to catch everything.
Yeah. Like when I ran the Kickstarter, I was working with Hiveworks, which they're not a publisher because they don't own the works, but they do kind of provide resources for putting your webcomics out there. So I worked with them to do the Kickstarter. So I think if I hadn't, it would it would have been even worse for me. But I worked with them. They helped with like fulfillment and stuff like that in outside of Canada. So that was super helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
And just last point I want to touch on, you're in Toronto, as am I. I'm assuming you're in
Yeah.
Toronto.
Yes. Yeah.
What's your impression of the art scene here? Like I'm personally impressed with how much talent and energy there is for comics and creators in the the realm of comic books and web comics and everything. What's your impression of being part of the Toronto scene?
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with you. I think it's a really great scene. It's a really like close-knit scene. I think everyone knows everyone um in this like city, which is good because I think it's a very supportive community. When I first started out, I decided to go and rent studio space. It was called the Comic Book Embassy in Kensington Market. And I shared that space with like five other artists who did comics, but also some other fine art stuff. And it was really fantastic because everyone was so supportive and they taught me a lot about the industry. Like I had no idea about it, and just like being in that space, I learned so much. I was introduced to so many other creators here in Toronto. So I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
No, it's great. Well, love what you're doing. Best of luck on Verse and Loving Ohio. It was a pleasure having you in the asylum, and look forward to chatting with you sometime in the future.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
All right.